Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle. I'm your host, Scott Myslinski. Normally, I interview top researchers, doctors, citizen scientists, and N=1 case studies, and dig into meaty topics around carnivore and ketogenic diets. Today will be a bit different. In this episode, I'll be detailing my recent deviation from a strict carnivore diet to a high carbohydrate diet. Why I did it, how I did it, what happened to me, as well as some general takeaways for listeners. I want to mention at the outset of this episode that I still think the carnivore diet is probably the best baseline diet for me, as well as many others, especially those with autoimmune issues such as Crohn's, depression, arthritis, PCOS, etc. So why did I do it? Why did I try a high carbohydrate diet? I'll start with some history and context and just go through that very quickly because a lot of folks may be familiar. I'd been strict carnivore for 3 full years, starting in October of 2016, and had almost no cheats whatsoever. Really very strict, no dairy for most of it, and no cheats, no carbs whatsoever. The only exception to that is for 1 week in 2017, I tried to do a more ketogenic style approach, and there I tried to reintroduce foods like spinach, cottage cheese, protein shakes, and avocados, but certainly no things like rice or traditional carbohydrates. I found stomach upset rather quickly, and then went quickly back to a strict carnivore diet after that. Now, why did I do it? The last few years, and especially more recently, I've been having problems with getting to a higher fat and more moderate protein intake. So backing up, why is higher fat desirable, in my opinion? So based on folks I've had on this show, Dr. Paul Saladino, Josh Blackburn, Logical Links, and many others, I feel that getting most of your energy from protein is not optimal. I see protein as a building block and fat and carbohydrates as energy sources. Fat is more of a slow burning energy source, which will put you in ketosis and will inhibit a lot of the modern diseases associated with hyperinsulinemia. But they're both energy sources. Protein, once you get a sufficient amount, which I would define as roughly a gram per pound of body weight, above that, it's not a great fuel source because your body has to pull it through gluconeogenesis, not push. It's not a supply-driven process. It's a demand-driven process. But when you have less energy from fat and carbs, your body needs to use more protein for energy, which I think is not ideal because it's really not meant to be an energy source. So my calorie requirements as a young active male weighing about 167 pounds at 5'10", I need about 2,800 to 3,000 calories to maintain my weight. And I found that I tap out at about 175 grams of fat. Above that, if I eat above that amount for 2 weeks at a time, I feel better on average every day. More mental clarity, more energy, more resilience, better mood, less hunger between meals, etc. But after 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, like clockwork, I get nausea at night, far away from my meals. I get bloating and stomach upset, and like my stomach is very full, and then sometimes I wake up with burping in the middle of the night, which I really hate. And then it goes away after about 3 days of dropping the fat back down. But those 3 days are really rough. There's a lot of insomnia. I'm waking up and going to the bathroom. There's a ton of pain, pressure in my stomach, etc. And I have tried so many things to get around this. I've tried different types of fat. I've tried suet, raw suet. I've tried more from butter, ghee, just eating fattier cuts of meat, eliminating ground beef, eliminating rendered fat sources, which can cause a lot of problems for people, like the drippings that come off of ground beef. And still, if I try the higher fat, I have these symptoms. And I've also tried things like supplementing with betaine, taking that with especially my higher fat meals, and a bunch of other interventions that should work for someone like me. And I think it comes down to low stomach acid, inability to digest the high amounts of fat, but consistently I found it's around the 175 grams of fat per day mark. So what does that mean? To fill in the remainder of 2,800 to 3,000 calories, and assuming I'm not eating any carbs or like trace carbs from things like eggs, that means I need over 300 grams of protein a day, which I enjoy eating. I feel great eating. That's not the problem. But again, I think that's not ideal from a metabolic standpoint to be getting the majority of your energy from protein, or a lot of your energy from protein. So that's what happens to me when I eat higher fat. A lot of people find they don't feel as good on the higher fat approach, and they do get sick. The nice thing is that you can always go back very quickly and adjust to higher protein percentage. And I encourage people to experiment with this. See what you can do. And see how you feel on different ends. You may very well feel that you feel so much better on a higher protein. I personally feel like I feel like 20% better on a higher fat approach, but I can't sustain it because of the digestive issues. So I typically land around 125 to 175 grams of fat and 300 to 360 grams of protein on a given day. So therefore, I had this idea, and a lot of this comes from following a big passion of mine, which I don't talk about a lot on the podcast, is weightlifting, and I won't call it bodybuilding because I haven't ever done a contest or gotten down to very lean amounts of body fat, and I'm not, certainly won't pretend to be like anywhere close to a fitness model or bodybuilder in terms of my physique, but I do enjoy lifting and trying to build muscle. And so a lot of the folks in that space, in the quote unquote evidence-based fitness space, really are not fans of ketogenic diets, and they're fans of higher protein or a mix of protein and fat. So I thought, based on all of this, based on the fact that I can't seem to get more energy from fat, let's try introducing some carbohydrates. So I also thought it may help with my sleep. I was having a lot of sleep disturbances, and I'll get to whether that panned out. But my goal has been to increase or maintain my weight while I lift weights without getting a lot of my energy from protein. I'll also admit that while it was definitely not a primary driver, some of the social flexibility around living in a carb-driven society and being able to go out to various restaurants or just go out with a team or easily grab a piece of fruit seemed appealing. It wasn't a main driver, like I said, but it was a side benefit that I thought would be enjoyable. So how did I do this? I started with adding one food at a time, similar to a reintroduction diet like Whole30, and I explicitly chose which food sources I thought would be least disruptive to my gut, based on sort of what I remembered from my past, and also what a lot of other folks recommend, like the folks at Paleomedicina in Hungary. They're a medical clinic using a paleo ketogenic diet to treat their patients, which is very high in fat. But they do allow, in some exceptions, for folks who are on more of a maintenance program, to introduce a certain amount of plants, and they have a hierarchy of which plants are better. So I began with honey. Some would argue it's a carnivore food. It's made by animals. It's fairly benign. It's just a very simple sugar, no fiber, obviously. So I was beginning with a tablespoon or two of honey at night as I went to bed in my tea, and then I would have some pre-workout as well. That seemed to work well. No issues there. Was definitely getting kicked out of ketosis with that and wasn't strictly carnivore, but I did that for a day or two, noticed no issues. A couple days later, I tried fruit. So blueberries, bananas, again, seemed very benign, a little bit of fiber in there, some stomach rumbling. I definitely quickly noticed I started pooping more. Sorry if that's too much information, but the fiber definitely makes you do that quickly, even from small amounts. Then I gradually added in things like Greek yogurt, which you could argue is carnivore because it's an animal food, but just plain Greek yogurt. And then I added some more high carb sources like rice, white rice, which is fairly benign, just having plain white rice, and then oatmeal. And then eventually I got to the point where I was having trace amounts of vegetables as well, less than half a cup per day. And so eventually where I settled was I was steadily consuming about 330 grams of carbs per day, so about 2 grams per pound of body weight, 75 grams of fat-ish, sometimes lower, sometimes closer to 55, and about 180 grams of protein, so at least 1 gram per pound of body weight. I pre-cooked my food, so I knew exactly what I was getting, and a typical day of eating looked like a cup of dry oatmeal in the morning with some blueberries and a couple whole eggs, and maybe some egg whites or a turkey patty. And then for lunch or sometime before my workout, I would have like a whey protein shake and a banana. I'd work out. I'd come back. I'd have about a few cups of rice and a turkey patty and maybe a tiny amount of vegetables for lunch, maybe a piece of fruit. And then for dinner, I was able to have the remainder of the rice, maybe a few cups, as well as a piece of fruit and maybe some Greek yogurt. So that's kind of what it looked like. Now I'll get into kind of results. What did I experience? How did I feel? So at first, I definitely had the hypoglycemia type energy surges and crashes that people talk about, coming off a ketogenic diet and going back to carbs, or people talk about coming from carbs saying, oh, I'm so glad I don't have this anymore on a ketogenic diet. I had the brain fog that is typical of people reintroducing carbs, and I have cravings for more carbs. Lastly, I was more hungry between meals, and especially in the morning. I would almost wake up with like a grumbling stomach. I think a lot of this is I was sticking to a meal schedule of eating my last meal around 5:30 or 6, and then eating breakfast around 7:30. So fasting is harder on a high carb diet. That's definitely true. But what's interesting is after about a week of doing this, so I did it for roughly a total of 3 weeks, 4 weeks with a break in between, I felt some of these symptoms started to go away. So Danny Vega talked about this on his podcast with Kevin Stock on Kevin Stock Radio. I'd encourage you guys to check that out, where he talks, at first your blood sugar can be pretty out of control when you add any carb sources coming from a ketogenic, low-carb, carnivore diet, but your blood sugar adjusts. And so after about a week is what he's experienced, and there's not a lot of good research on this. Some of these things, your blood sugar becomes more regulated, and you're able to handle the carbs a little bit better, similar to how you get better fat adapted, but on a shorter term basis. So wasn't having the same energy surges and crashes, wasn't having the brain fog. I felt good during the day mentally. I was getting a little hungry between meals than I do on carnivore, but not dramatically so. And then other things, I mentioned that I was definitely going to the bathroom more, but I wasn't having indigestion at first. So that's interesting. So I would think that introducing all these carbs, fair amount of fiber, like 20 grams of fiber per day, that my stomach would be just wrecked right off the bat, but it wasn't. And that may be because I was on a carnivore diet for so long that my gut has started to heal. I was also sleeping better. As I said, that was one of my goals by reintroducing the carbs, but that's very confounded by me dropping caffeine around the same time. I still have to do a podcast on how I dropped caffeine, why, and what resulted. But the short story is dropping caffeine has dramatically improved my sleep, especially deep sleep. It's much more consistent and higher. And I think, that seemed to be true before I introduced the carbs. And I think that has more to do with the caffeine than carbs. So hard to completely discern, but I don't think carbs improve my sleep. Enjoyment, I somewhat enjoyed the meals, but to be honest, 4 cups of rice just doesn't taste great plain. I was trying to use a bunch of sauces like coconut aminos and mustard and things like that, salsa to try to make it tastier. But honestly, these were like big, bodybuilder style, boring meals, turkey, broccoli, and rice. So it wasn't super exciting. I wasn't going out and having, pancakes and pizza and cheat meals. So what eventually happened about a week ago is eventually I started getting horrible gas. I started getting really bad bloating, gas during the day. It was affecting my work. It was affecting my performance in the gym. I was having indigestion. And basically I just like felt bad all the time and I couldn't focus as much. And I was getting sleep disturbances from it again, similar to what I noted on the higher fat approach, where I would get this really bad bloating and burping in the middle of the night, but almost 10 times worse. And it was like 3 solid days in a row. And I just said, I can't keep doing this. I have to pull the plug. So that was last weekend that started happening. And so what will I do next? I've transitioned back to carnivore. I've done a few higher fat, moderate protein days to try to facilitate getting back into ketosis, make sure I'm not going straight from high carb to high protein and more moderate fat like I usually do, my carnivore. I think I got some very, very brief symptoms of keto flu, just a little bit of a headache on one day, and feeling kind of hot and run down. But, honestly, I was monitoring my electrolytes really well, drinking a lot of water, so it was fairly minimal. And overall, I'm not closing the book on carbs completely. I want to be clear about that, but they definitely complicate things. They make it harder to recognize how your body is feeling. Every new food you reintroduce makes it more complicated. And for the foreseeable future, I will be carnivore, strict carnivore, regardless of the fat or protein percent. And I won't be doing, a targeted ketogenic diet or some carbs pre-workout like I know some folks are doing with success. I'm just going to go back to my standard where I feel best. And I think, for my goals of staying healthy, having good energy and focus throughout the day, not having indigestion, and then after all of those things, building muscle and staying lean, I think the carnivore diet is the best thing for that. So what can you take home? So first of all, none of this is medical advice. I'm not a doctor, so I'll say that right at the outset. If you're having trouble maintaining or gaining weight on carnivore, a lot of people message me with this problem. The first thing I would try is increasing your fat. So try having more fat from non-rendered fat sources. So solid sources, so fattier cuts of meat, like ribeye, or you can get beef trimmings, or try even having some beef suet with your meals, if you can get that from a butcher. If you can't eat more fat, if you're like me, and you're not suffering from autoimmune issues, you may want to consider, well, first I would try dairy too. I would try cheese, milk, cheese first, then maybe milk, and see if that allows you to eat more food and maintain your weight, because those foods can be hyperpalatable. If those don't work, you can't eat more fat, dairy doesn't help, and you don't suffer from autoimmune issues, maybe consider some clean carb sources. I know that sounds like blasphemy, but just bear with me for a minute. Look into Stan Efferding's vertical diet. What this is it's essentially majority of your calories and the majority of your food is beef. You're eating beef. That's the basis of your diet. On top of the beef, you're integrating things that can help you gain weight, like white rice, like whole milk, honey, as sources of carbs. These are foods that will make you gain weight. They will spike your insulin, and that could be helpful for someone who's really having trouble maintaining their weight. But if you do have autoimmune issues, or you're fine with how your weight is trending, you're not upset that you're losing weight, or you're able to maintain your weight on carnivore just fine, which a lot of people are, carbs probably aren't worth it. So that's my kind of summary of why I tried carbohydrates, what I did, how it affected me, and what I think it means for you. I'd highly encourage you to check out Kevin Stock's article at kevinstock.io on his carb experiments. I think he has even greater insight than anything I provided, and a lot of excellent research there on he starts with all the problems with carbs and reasons you shouldn't be eating carbs, and then gets into why he tried it, how he tried it, and was very systematic about it. I think that's a really interesting article, and I agree with his conclusions there. I think he's going to release it as a podcast as well on Kevin Stock Radio, his podcast, and then he talks with the Strong Sisters and with Danny Vega about some of those things. But highly encourage you to check that out if you're interested. So I'd love to know, what questions do you have for me? Have you experimented with carbs? What hate mail do you have for me? What else would you like to share? You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Carnivore Cast, or go to www.carnivorecast.com. And until next time, keep it carnivore.